All right.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. We're glad that you're here this evening. My name is David Brannicky. I'm the pastor of the Grace Baptist Church of Bluebell, and we're glad that you've decided to join with us on our study this evening on finding home, an Advent study on welcoming refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. The theme of our evening tonight is joy and release. And our hope for this study is to provide an opportunity to engage with one another, but also with individuals who have traveled a journey or who are traveling a journey of immigration to our country. We recognize that this can be a difficult and complex issue, but I think when we bring it down to the human story, it becomes much more clear for us. And when we integrate that human story with the call that we receive in the biblical background, in the biblical text, we begin to see how those integrate and then how they might lead us to take action that God would be calling us to. So a couple housekeeping orders before we begin is that if you have questions during the session this evening, we invite you to type those in the chat box, and we'll be monitoring those. And after we've had a couple presenters and interviews, we'll have an open time of discussion. So that would be the first housekeeping item. The second housekeeping item is to please make sure that you stay muted. And then a third thing is this is a 3-week series beginning this evening, and then next Wednesday, and then the following Wednesday. And we invite you to come back each Wednesday, and if you're unable to make it back, that's okay as well. But we also invite you to extend an invitation to others in your network of friends and family. So our the study originated, we decided to do it during Advent because Advent is all about waiting, finding home. And we believe as those of us who've been working on putting this together believe that as we work together and we provide home and we provide welcome, we ourselves find our home as well. So I think that's all of the housekeeping items to take care of. So I'm going to turn it over to Ray Skellinger and allow him to introduce himself this evening.
Hi, my name is Ray. I think I know most of you, not all, but I'm very glad that you're here with us tonight. I work with immigration and refugee issues with partners around the world on behalf of the American Baptist Church's International Ministries. This is my passion. I want to share with you from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. And Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. And he went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. After she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. Well, the nativity scene, which is born in these verses, becomes the basis of our remembrance of Jesus's birth and the circumstances of much of his early life. So many of our early Sunday school Christmas programs revolved around assembling the manger and playing the different parts of the animals, the shepherds, angels, and of course, Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus. But first comes the rejection of the Holy Family. There was no room for them in the inn or anywhere else for that matter. And for this reason, he was born among donkeys and sheep. Well, the Mexican tradition of posada is also based on this story. And it's a play in 9 acts. As it's celebrated from the 16th to the 24th of December, each evening, people gather and they sing a song. Night after night, They remember the refusal of the welcome for Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. And the song is quite harsh if you listen to the words of this. Initially, the pilgrims come, Joseph and Mary, and they ask, and as they sing, "In the name of heaven, I beg you for lodging, for she cannot walk, my beloved wife." But the answer they get back is extremely difficult, extremely harsh. "This is not an inn, so keep going. I cannot open. You may be a rogue." But they beg, "Do not be inhuman. Have mercy on us. The God of the heavens will reward you for it. Now, can you go now and don't bother us anymore? Because if I become annoyed, I'm going to give you a thrashing." "But we're worn out. Coming from Nazareth, I'm just a carpenter, Joseph by name." And the answer is, "I don't care about your name. Let me sleep because I already told you we will not open up." And this goes on night after night, the rejection, until the 24th, the final night. And they rewrite history, because this is not the way it happened in the Bible. But the tradition says that Joseph then says, "But my wife is Mary. She's the Queen of Heaven, and she's going to be the mother of the divine word." And the innkeeper says, "Are you Joseph? Your wife is Mary? Oh, please enter, pilgrims, because I did not recognize you." They could not recognize what they did not see before. But in the end, they get it right. And this is kind of the way we celebrate it too. If you remember one of the Christian hymns that I remember singing quite a bit. Now, the wording on this is very old English. It's, thou didst leave thy throne and thy kingly crown." And if I can put that into more modern English, it says, "You left your throne and your kingly crown when you came to earth for me, but in Bethlehem's home there found no room for your holy nativity. It'll come to my heart, Lord Jesus. There is room in my heart for you. Oh, come to my heart, Lord Jesus, come. There is room in my heart for you." We know that they refused the Holy Family at the beginning of the story, but we will not do that, right? We have room. We will not be like those who refused the Holy Family. In our world today, there are 75 million displaced people. They're migrants, refugees, asylum seekers. They've been forced from home by hunger, war, persecution, violence, economic collapse. The major states around the world from which people are leaving, are Myanmar, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, Cameroon, Venezuela, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. These people leave with only what they can carry, their children in tow, with very little idea of where they might be able to go. Meanwhile, the doors that they hope to one day enter are closing very quickly all the way around the world. And I wonder, since Jesus said, "Whatever you did for the least of these, you have done to me," do we not recognize who we have before us now? Behold, they stand at the door and knock. In the last 2 years, I've had the opportunity to sit with and talk with and walk with migrants from Central America as they crossed Mexico, trying to make it to the US border, with migrants from around the world in shelters in Tijuana asking for asylum, refugees from Myanmar and Bangladesh and Thailand and Malaysia, refugees from Syria, Yemen, North Africa, in Lebanon, and in Jordan. And in almost every case, the situation's the same. They left with everything they could carry, nothing more, with very little idea of where they might eventually be able to go. And behold, they stand at the door and knock. While I walked with a number of people on the highways in Colombia and Ecuador, side by side with Venezuelans who had no idea where they were going, that only knew that they had to go and had to go somewhere because their country is in free fall. I recorded some of their story, most of all, their pain and their hope.
¿Cómo te llamas? ¿Cómo te llamas?
Gilbert,
¿Y de dónde eres?
de Guaro.
Me llamo Manuel Antonio Rodríguez Ramos.
De Briceño Pérez.
Héctor Gabriel Martínez Sánchez.
Kennedy José García Pérez.
Rosbeli Linares.
Joanny González.
Soy Alberto Ponce Azuaje.
Charlie Eduardo Figueredo García.
Divisaya Arena.
Neymar Escobar Arenas Antonio.
Jaime René Monsalve Sánchez.
Jocelyn.
Anderson.
¿Y sus hijos?
Vanessa. Juan Diego.
Ángel.
Yesirey. Génesis Torreal.
Me llamo Gregory Javier Pinto Ramírez. Mi hijo Adán Xavier Pinto Rondón.
Por la situación en la que estamos. Demasiado rudo, fuerte. No hay empleo, no se consigue nada. Todo está caro, el dinero no te alcanza, lo que trabajas no te alcanza para nada.
Emigré de mi país por necesidad de comida, medicamentos.
Nada, ahora un pantalón, una sábana, 3 camisas y 4 boxes. Lo único que tenía la ropa y bueno, ya Rosbeli, que anda conmigo y listo.
Vale, en mi mochila tengo 2 pantalones, cargo 3 suéteres, cargaba un par de chancletas y unos zapatos. Y pues más nada.
Ropa y bueno, mucha fuerza para seguir.
Tengo 2 pantalones,
¿Qué más?
2 chemis y un suéter y la sábana.
Como 3 mudas de ropa y un edredón y una almohada.
Mi ropa que cargo. No cargo muchas cosas, un bolsito nada más.
Empacamos primero y principal abrigo de los niños, cargamos abrigos, sábana, agua para el viaje y bueno, sobre todo mucho abrigo, pues, abrigo para los niños.
Empaqué abrigos, cobijas, algo de vestimenta, porque tampoco hay que estar por ahí, tampoco que lo vean a uno como un pordiosero.
Poquita ropa que empacamos.
Con ropa,
de los niños.
ropa de los niños.
De la ropa.
¿Sí? ¿Y algo más?
Sí, solo la ropa, más nada. No teníamos más nada.
Nada, la ropa que teníamos. Más nada.
Bueno, extraño todo lo de allá, mi familia, la comida, el estar allá, la brisa, todo. Lo extraño todo porque no es diferente estar en el país de uno. No es nada como estar en su tierra.
Mi mamá, los consejos que me daba. Extraño mucho a mi familia, a los amigos de barrio.
Lo que extraño de Venezuela es mi familia y la música.
Mi familia.
Mi familia.
Mi familia.
Mi madre, mis hijos, mis hermanos, toda mi familia.
Extraño mucho a mi familia, mi país.
Mi familia.
Nuestra familia.
La familia.
Mi familia. Mis padres.
A nuestra familia, vecinos, que mis hermanitos están allá solos y no tienen comida, y mamá
Son
quiere
los
ir
más
para allá y no
chiquitos.
tenemos los pasajes.
Extraño mi hija, mi familia y mi hogar.
Uy, mi casa, mi familia, mi mamá, mis hermanos, mi hijo, mi esposa, el otro que viene en camino.
Mira, la realidad, extraño mi Venezuela de hace 21 años atrás, donde vivíamos como unos millonarios, donde vivíamos como reyes. Y hoy en día se me bajan las lágrimas, me dan dolores en el corazón de ver por lo que estamos pasando.
Mi sueño siempre ha sido ser futbolista y no ha podido llegar a esa meta.
Establecerme en el otro país donde vaya, lograr cumplir mi sueño, porque una familia desde abajo, desde cero, y tener una buena educación que le dé a mis hijos desde pequeños.
Conseguir un trabajo bueno y trabajar para comprar mi casa, para los míos y hacer un negocio allá en Venezuela.
Mi sueño es poder tener mi familia estable allá en Venezuela y bueno, de yo poder formalizar también mi propia familia de una manera que no pueda pasar trabajo y sobre todo de poder terminar mis estudios y seguir teniendo un mejor bienestar, tanto como para mí como para mi familia.
Un empleo para tener una mejor vida aquí. Alcanzar todas mis metas que tengo pensado y ayudar a mi familia.
Mi sueño es que algún día Venezuela se acomode, consiga un buen trabajo aquí estable para ayudar a mi familia, a mis hijos, a mi madre, a todos.
Mi sueño es que mis hijos estén bien y tengan una mejor vida que llevaban en Venezuela, que pasaban hambre. Mis hijos pasaron mucha hambre, gastaron trabajo. No podernos vestir bien, vernos bien, tener una economía mejor, una mejor situación. Pues.
Como todo venezolano, surgir y queremos una Venezuela mejor.
¡Una Venezuela libre!
Que Venezuela se acomode.
Pues primordial que Venezuela se acomode y que toda mi familia se una nuevamente, porque unos están por un lado, otros están por el otro, y eso es lo más triste que hay.
Mi sueño, sigue adelante y ayudar a las personas.
Yo quiero ir para Perú, vecino, pero no nos hemos ido porque está muy difícil agarrar mula y no tenemos los pasajes.
Mi sueño es tener mi propia casa, tener mi familia estable.
¿En dónde?
En mi país, Venezuela.
Bueno, yo llego hasta donde haya posibilidad, pues conseguir mandarle a mis hijos y regresarme de nuevo.
Llegar al Ecuador para ver si no regresarme a mi tierra. Es duro la vida, pero ¿qué más? ¿Qué más le toca a uno? El bienestar de ellos es lo que uno lo hace.
Volverme a encontrar con toda mi familia.
Thank you, Ray, for sharing that. My name is Sarah Stroessel-Kagi, and I serve as the pastor of Royersford Baptist Church in Royersford, Pennsylvania, and I'm delighted to be part of the team that is bringing this to you tonight. We are very blessed to be able to hear the story tonight of Benson Juguna. Did I say that right, Benson?
Perfectly well.
Practically right. All right. Benson is currently residing at Ray's house. Benson is an asylum seeker from Kenya who left Kenya to come to the United States to escape government persecution. He made it to the US border, presented himself for asylum, and then spent the next 14 months in detention. He was released just about a month ago to Ray's home, where he is currently residing and working on what happens next. So Benson, we are so glad. That was just the quick version. We're so glad to have you with us tonight. So first things first, Benson, why did you leave Kenya? Why did you leave home?
I was a witness in an investigation, in a corruption investigation against our government, and due to that, my life got threatened, and I was tortured and persecuted in an effort to silence me, and so I had to leave for my life.
And when you left, what did you take with you?
Pretty much nothing. I left in a hurry, so pretty much nothing, just my passport. and my wallet in my pockets. So yeah.
And so you came to the United States. How did you get from Kenya to here? Tell us about, coming to the border and that process.
So basically from my country, I went to Singapore, and unfortunately, Singapore doesn't have a formal asylum procedure. And I had to leave because I was being followed. I went to Dubai. Unfortunately, I could not stay as well. And so I left to Panama, and from Panama, I took a bus up all the way to the Mexican border with the United States, where I waited for almost 2 months before I was allowed in.
You waited on the Mexican side, like in Mexico, to be able to get an appointment to come into the United States.
Sure.
And then what happened once you got that appointment? You're let into the United States. How did you end up in detention?
So it's essentially the Mexican government decides who goes in, when. So I was fortunate to get in and handed over to the Custom and Border Protection, where they do a skimmy interview. They keep you at a place called the call house for a few days, for some people a few months, especially if you have wounds. And from there, I was transferred to Arizona, to a facility in Arizona. Stayed there for a few days, was transferred again to Tallahatchie in Mississippi, where I had my credible fear, following which I was transferred to Pine Prairie in Louisiana, where I spent close to 1 year before we were tagged troublemakers and moved to Allen Parish, and came a storm. I was moved again to Richwood and back to Allen Parish. And
now you were moved because you were a troublemaker, you said?
Pretty much. Pretty much.
Tell us about the trouble that you caused.
So I'm a lawyer by profession and an accountant, and so while in detention, I realized I could make good use of the time I was serving there to try and assist other people in their cases, especially those who never had the privilege of having attorneys. And so I was helping out a few people to file for the appeal cases in immigration and habeas corpus and civil suits in the federal courts against ICE, basically highlighting some of the infringements into people's rights that ICE was doing at the federal court. And a few of the people were ordered released, and we organized civil disobedience. And I was tagged to have been the so-called leader of the group, and taken into confinement under disciplinary, before disciplinary committees, which I argued out, they really didn't have anything against me. And so eventually I was taken back to the dorms, and I think they decided the best way to stop everything was to separate me with the people who I had gotten acquitted with. And so
you were moved between several more places at that point. And then tell us about being released. Why were you released?
Just to mention specifically to facilities which didn't have library services. So to make sure I was not able to continue filing my cases.
Interesting. And about a month ago, right, you were released. So tell us a little bit about that. Why was it a long process to get released, or how did that come about?
About 6 months ago, I filed a civil suit against ICE, requesting a judge to declare my detention unconstitutional. And since then, we've had a few forth and backs with the court and the agency. At some point, they gave a declaration which was full of what I would call misguiding information to the court. And so I filed a motion for discovery to be allowed to depose the specific ICE agent who wrote the document. In the meantime, my lawyers were also trying to pursue my release by through the Freiheit decision and through parole. And Ray also contacted one journalist who was able to highlight my story into a magazine, a Christian magazine, and intentionally shared it out as much as he could. And so the morning that the motion for discovery was granted, allowing us to depose ICE for 7 hours, I spoke to Ray that morning with no idea that I was going to get released, only for me to learn about an hour and a half later that I was going to be released in a few hours. And yeah, it came as a shock to me, and I was excited. It was on a short notice, so I know how difficult it was for Ray to try and organize the logistics to ensure someone picked me up, because most of those detentions are in the middle of nowhere. So yeah, I got released, and someone picked me up, and Ray made arrangements for me to get here.
So when you're released, it's not that they give you a lot of warning and a hotel to stay in and a plane ticket. They just sort of say, all right, time's up, you're out, right?
Yeah, basically they call my migration attorney and told him, you know, we intend to release this guy, so pick up your baggage from now on.
Wow.
So, you know, literally.
Wow. Now I want to back up a little bit in your story, because you did have your credible fear interview and that sort of thing, and you did sit before the judge who would rule on whether or not you could be allowed in, correct?
Yes.
And what was the result of that hearing?
It wasn't good. So essentially, just to mention, my case was based on the persecution in the hands of the government, and to be specific, an equivalent of the Secret Service in this country and an equivalent of the FBI in my country. Now, in this country, you guys call them FBI, which included, you know, torture, beatings. I was stabbed at some point. Two of my core witnesses were assassinated in cold blood. One shot more than 74 bullets. And an assassination attempt in which my driver was killed in the process. And unfortunately, simply because I knew the deputy president in person way before all these troubles began, an immigration judge denied my asylum, claiming it was a personal reason. It was a personal issue between me and the vice president.
Not political.
And not political. And went ahead to mention that my torture did not rise to the level of persecution, which to me was a surprise, because I mean, I was at the verge of death. So it was a bit surprising to me and to the lawyers as well. And so I'm currently under appeal at the Board of Immigration Appeals, and hopefully hoping for a better result, God willing.
So I know we just have a couple more minutes because we still have someone else to get to, even though we could sit and hear your story for hours, Benson. But so just really quick, so you're in appeal right now. So that means that you'll sit before a judge again to rehear your story, your case. What happens if it's held up, if they say no?
Honestly, I have no idea, to be honest. The one thing I know is I'm not willing to go back to my country, and I guess I don't know. even if it would mean I resisting to get on that plane and being taken to prison, to me it's a better option than going back home. So I just hope he doesn't get there. Yeah, I think I have one shot at it, and I think my life depends on this.
Mm. What do you miss most about home?
Everything, you know. My family. I come from a big family, so I miss them all. We're going to be having a get together next year, which most times I'm the convener on behalf of my grandmother, and for the first time I'll not be there. I miss my grandmother. She brought me up, and she's fighting cancer currently, and I feel I'm not there for her when probably she needs me most. So I miss my life. I miss the days when I didn't have to look who, maybe who was following me. Sometimes I get paranoid. When I came here, there's a neighbor here who has a van, and I used to get so scared until severally I went and checked into the van who was there. I miss liberty from internal fear, the freedom from that fear, and the thought of there's a chance that I could be taken back to a place where I would be killed. Sometimes gives me sleepless nights. Yeah. I hope it shall be well. Everything happens for a reason, and I hope this is for a reason in God's hands.
So Benson, you know that we chose to do this study during Advent for a lot of reasons, and in Advent Ray, I'm pretty sure that's your phone. This week in Advent is when we light the candle of hope. And so where do you find hope right now?
I guess I find hope in the fact that I believe in God, the Father Almighty, the fact that He would sacrifice His Son for us. I believe He would be willing to save me and give me a longer life to see my daughter graduate, see her of age, see my grandmother again, and just give her a hug. And I miss telling my mom everything is okay. Well, I actually believe it is, not when I'm just trying to console her. That's why I find hope in. I find hope in the thought that there's a better tomorrow, and that in everything that we go through, God has a purpose. And I know it shall be well. I do.
Amen.
I do.
Well, Benson, like I said, we could go on for hours, but we don't want to keep folks too late tonight. So I thank you so much for sharing just that little bit of your story with us, and know that you are in our prayers constantly. One of the places I find hope, Benson, is in you. because you have seen unimaginable things. And I know from talking to Ray and talking to you that you are working tirelessly, not just for your own case, but for others. You got yourself moved around from detention to detention because you were helping others. And I think that that's a beautiful thing. That's the kind of trouble we should all be known for. And so that is where I find hope in you. So
maybe just to mention, I think maybe that's one of the purposes that's why God took me to detention. Probably he knew someone somewhere in detention needed someone to assist them. And sometimes I convince myself that maybe one day ICE will just come and pick me up because I continue helping out people. Every time I'm telling Ray to take me to the post office to post court briefs for guys. Every time I'm receiving calls from them in detention, them begging me to file for them papers. Sometimes I get scared that maybe one day ICE will come pick me up and take me back to detention. But again, I find solace in the fact that even if I can't have what I want, maybe I can help others achieve their goal. And I think sometimes it's worth sacrificing yours for the sake of others. So I think that's what keeps me going. The fact that I've seen people extremely low in detention, and we filed cases for people who've been released, and sometimes they just call me and they're like, Benson, thank you so much. And I'm like, don't thank me, thank God. To some extent, he made us meet. And so I think that gives me some hope to keep going, to keep doing what I can until God decides it's my time to go. So yeah.
Amen.
Amen. Amen. Well, thank you, Benson. And we will have some time for some questions afterwards. If you do have questions, you can type them into the chat so we can get them moving. And now we will pass it over to Ray and our next guest, Paulina. So Ray, take it away.
Yeah, so it's my pleasure to introduce you to Paulina Olvera Cañas, who is the co-director and founder of Espacio Migrante, which is a shelter in Tijuana, a shelter among many other things. They do a lot, and I'll allow Paulina to share with you about those things. So Paulina, welcome. Thank you so much for coming and being in this space with us.
No, it's my pleasure, and thank you for the invitation, and also Benson, thank you for your story. I'm deeply touched by it.
Well, Pauline, can you tell us a little bit about Espacio Migrante and how you started?
Yes, so Espacio Migrante is an organization based in Tijuana, Mexico, in the border with California. And we started in 2012 as a group of young people, some of us students or recently graduated. And we wanted to do something as residents of Tijuana. I'm from a border community since I was born. So we wanted to do something, and we thought that a way to do it was through education. So we began a project at a local shelter to give computer classes. And that's kind of how we started. Later, we became an organization in Tijuana, and we have been growing ever since. And 2 years ago, we opened up a shelter. So right now we have a shelter for families, as well as a community center in downtown Tijuana.
And tell us a little bit about where your clients have come from over these last several years.
Back when we started, it was mostly with migrants from Central America or from other parts of Mexico that were trying to get to the US. But in 2016 in Tijuana, we received a large migration of Haitian families, which was something new for Tijuana. And also it's the first time that we received families with children, like complete families. So that brought challenges for Tijuana, for the shelters. And since we opened as a shelter 2 years ago, We have received families from more than 10 different countries, mostly from Central America, from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, but also from other parts of Mexico, from the Caribbean, mostly Haiti and Cuba, and also more recently from African countries, mostly from Cameroon, Ghana. So we have, Tijuana has become a place, like we have people from all over the world arriving to Tijuana now.
And as they arrive to Tijuana, where do you think they hope to go from there?
So most of the people that we attend are asylum seekers. So they are waiting in Tijuana to seek asylum in the US. I think in the last years, cities like Tijuana have become a big waiting room because of the different policies from the US and Mexico that have made it harder and harder and the wait time longer every time. So we provide them shelter and food for the families that stay in our shelter while they are waiting. This can take a couple of months or more than a year. And in our community center, we work with migrants that are in other shelters or that are not staying in shelters. We provide legal services and other services like Spanish and English classes and cultural activities and other types of programs.
So if most of the people that are coming to you have the hope to get into the US, and you mentioned the process could take some time. Next week, we'll have a chance to talk with Nicole Ramos about the MPP program and why people are waiting. But what are some of the barriers that have been put in place, which exist solely to keep people from realizing that dream? And how is it you confront those barriers?
Yes, so before 2016, when an asylum seeker would arrive to the port of entry, they would ask for asylum and they would have to be let in and processed inside of the US. Since Haitians arrived, about 20,000 Haitians arrived to Tijuana, the US and the Mexican government both created a system that is a metering system or an informal list where people have to sign up and then wait. But it's an informal list, which doesn't guarantee them anything. It's a handwritten list. It's kind of shady how they manage it. And this creates like a bottleneck in cities like Tijuana, because that means about 20, 50 people are let in daily, sometimes less. And that creates a long waiting time. Then last year, the US also created a program called MPP, or Migrant Protection Protocols, which means that after this waiting period, once they go into the US, they are sent back to Mexico to wait for their whole process while they're in Mexico. And they just show up to the port of entry every time they have a hearing and they go to court. But the fact that they are waiting in Mexico creates a lot of difficulties, because in Mexico, first they have to figure out how they're gonna find housing and food while they're waiting for this process, which can take more than 1 year. Then how do they get legal representation if they are not physically in the US? It becomes really difficult for them. Most asylum seekers show up to their hearings without an attorney, but that means that their chances are very slim of winning a case. And then in a city like Tijuana or other border cities like Ciudad Juárez, Matamoros, there's a big crime rate. So really they are not safe in Tijuana. Their lives are not safe, even though organizations like Espacio Migrante, a lot of Christian churches do their best to provide shelters and to lend a hand. The reality is that they are not safe in Tijuana. They also face discrimination, just the danger of being in a city that is full of crime and cartels. And yes, like they find difficulty to have a life while they are waiting for this long process. So, and another thing is that since last year, our Mexican government also started collaborating with the US administration to also start detaining migrants. So we're seeing that our Mexican authorities are doing the same job that the Border Patrol is doing in the US. They're patrolling our streets and detaining migrants. And we have also seen that particularly Black migrants are detained because of racial profiling. And many times they're also deported back to their home country before they can even ask for asylum in the US. So we see that the Mexican government is collaborating, but not for good reasons. They are collaborating to keep asylum seekers away from reaching safety.
Well, so I can see clearly how this puts so much more strain on the families, the people that are waiting. But I imagine it also, adds a lot more to your caseload and the work you have to do, because initially, as people were coming through, they might stay with you a couple of weeks while they waited for the chance to apply for asylum in the US. But now they do that and then they're back with you for months on end. So this creates a lot of difficulties. What are some of those challenges that those long wait times have created, and how is it that you as Espacio Migrante are supporting these families while they're waiting that long?
Yeah, so like you mentioned before, we have always been a city of migrants. So Tijuana did have about 8 shelters before 2016, but the load of work, because of the wait time that is so long, has increased so much that by December of 2016, we had 38 shelters. And most of them were Christian churches that opened their doors, even though they didn't have the infrastructure or the funds to do so. And it has been difficult because it puts a strain in our few resources, but also now it's not only about providing shelter and food for a couple of weeks, but many other things, because when you have families for so long waiting with uncertainty about what will happen with their cases, about if the border is gonna reopen, that creates also mental health problems. So we've even had in our shelter families, particularly I'm thinking about 2 young moms that in different times they had a nervous breakdown because it was so hard to live in uncertainty. So mental health has been one of the things that we have had to start working with, but also many other things like some of these families, while they're waiting, they decide to not sit around waiting in the shelter, but to try to go out and look for a job, start working. So we support them to integrate in Tijuana, but it becomes difficult because they can't really fully integrate when they don't have documents, when the Mexican authorities are also after them all the time. So it's difficult, but we try to provide that support while they are waiting. And some of them, in a few cases, when they can, they make the decision of staying in Mexico. Not because Mexico is a safe place, but sometimes the authorities in both countries make asylum almost impossible. So some of them decide to stay in Mexico, and we try to support them either with their legal documents or with their integration process in Tijuana too.
So in the midst of all these difficulties, and you mentioned earlier that you started with education. So I imagine that having kids in school is something that's almost impossible for a lot of these families. If there are 20, 30, 50,000 migrants waiting in Tijuana, what did they do for education? And are you able to help them get enrolled in schools?
Yes, so one good thing I think about right now with the pandemic that we're locked up in the shelter, we're keeping the families in quarantine. I don't know if that's how you say, but nobody's leaving or entering the shelter. And now they express that a lot of parents are interested in enrolling their children in school. Before, they wouldn't consider this because they saw Tijuana as a city where they're passing by. And also they don't trust the city. They don't think they're gonna be waiting for a long time. But now that they have been in Tijuana for over a year, they started telling us like they don't wanna waste their time for their children. They want their children to at least use this time to continue their education. So we reach out to the education authorities, and we have been able to enroll the children in our shelter to a local public school in Tijuana. But we're also aware that most migrants don't have even the opportunity to be in a shelter. So we started also reaching out in the community because we saw this interest, and we're supporting them to enroll in school. Tijuana has a program in the Department of Education that supposedly assures that a migrant child has a place in school. But the reality is that when parents go to a school and they ask if they can enroll their child, sometimes they get turned down. some principals or teachers say, oh, we need legal documents that prove you're staying in Mexico, or they might say it's only for Mexican children, even though this isn't supposed to happen. This is the reality that they face. They face a lot of discrimination or lack of information from the schools. So we're trying to inform people about the right of education, but also in Espacio Migrante and many other shelters, we have also tried to offer education programs inside the shelter. For example, in Espacio Migrante, we have an area called La Cipoteca, which is like from the word cipote, which means child in Central America, and it means the children's area. And it's a place where they can play, where we have volunteers to read stories, and maybe it's not formal education, but other types of education that also helps the children to play and like have some bit of normal circumstances despite living in a shelter.
Yeah, living in a shelter in a time of pandemic, in a place where there are so many barriers, and that it's wonderful. I know that you do a lot more too, in some very creative ways, trying to help people to address the long waits that they have, and to also open up and experience other parts of themselves which would otherwise remain locked away. You do some very interesting things with dance and music. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so when we started in 2012, we started as students with the computer classes, but we also we thought that one need was to raise awareness in our border community about the realities of migration. So we thought through cultural events was a good way to bring people together. But I think it wasn't until the Haitian community arrived that we started doing cultural events together with the migrant community. So that's why we have the part of our building is a cultural and community center, because we think it's also important to build community. So we do this through Spanish classes, but also some afternoons we have cooking sessions where the families at the shelter share some of their recipes. We have cultural events where the families at the shelter cook their food, and people in Tijuana and San Diego can taste the food. And we have a lot of dancing. Initially, the purpose of doing these cultural events was to raise awareness. But now we also see that it's a way of healing for them, and it helps with their mental health. And we have a phrase called resiste gozando, which is joyful resistance. And we have found that it's a way of resisting. I have a friend, I go to school in San Diego, so on the US side of the border. And I invited a friend to our community center one day, and she was surprised because we had an event and people were dancing and sharing things about their cultures. And she said she expected to arrive to a shelter and see a lot of sadness, despair. And of course, like the stories are real. Like, I'm not gonna say that everything is pink and like there's no, like this isn't a reality. It's a reality, but I think this speaks about the resilience of our communities. Even when I was seeing the video that you showed, Ray, that people kept mentioning, I miss my food, my music. So I think that's the importance of having a space where they can share these things. And I think that both the Mexican and the US government are working together to do everything to discourage asylum seekers. And their ultimate goal is to have them abandon their cases and go back to their country. But when we have these cultural events and when we're building community, I have a phrase that our psychologist mentioned, and I really liked it, which is, yeah, don't worry, we'll wait for you here while we're dancing. So it's like, aquí te espero bailando. It's like, yeah, go on, we'll wait. And meanwhile, we'll be resisting by dancing, by building community. So that's kind of what we're trying to do in Espacio Migrante to, yes, like to allow for people to have hope and to maintain this hope.
That's such a beautiful image, Paulina, and I think Espacio Migrante lives that out so well. You throw the very best parties in any migrant shelter I've ever seen. And the only migrant shelter I know that, and I know the Baptists among us in our audience are probably going to are going to chafe at this idea. But in addition to dancing, you also serve the best mojitos in any migrant shelter. You really want to make sure that you have a celebration and people are able to keep that hope and that celebration alive. And so I celebrate that, and that's one of the reasons why Espacio Migrante is, I think, one of the very best examples of shelters anywhere, because you minister to the whole person and all of their needs. We have some questions, and I want to make sure we have some time to get to some of those. So I want to thank you so much, Paulina. If you would, perhaps you could write in the chat your address and the name. If anybody's interested in supporting Espacio Migrante, this is one of the ministries that we as international ministries have supported. But if anybody else is interested in supporting directly, you could send it through international ministries, or you can send it directly to Espacio Migrante. And maybe someday reserve your place at one of their celebrations, because they are beautiful folkloric celebrations they have. So Paulina, thank you. Thank you so much for your work and investing your life into helping other lives shine. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Ray and Paulina, for that conversation. And we do have some questions in the text box that I'll bring up here to folks. Just the first one is how do citizens of Tijuana feel about the migrants? Is there fear or resentment towards the migrants? I guess that would be for you, Paulina.
So if you would have asked me in 2016, I would have said that the community in Tijuana receives migrants with open arms, because in 2016, when Haitians arrived, I saw a big show of solidarity from Tijuana residents and also from people in Los Angeles, San Diego, that were coming to bring donations, volunteers. But when 2 years ago, when the caravan from Central America arrived, unfortunately, we saw also an ugly side of the narrative, because we saw the media in Mexico and the local authorities in Tijuana repeating the same narratives as the Trump administration and saying, here comes a wave of criminals, dangerous people that are coming. And unfortunately, I also saw part of the community in Tijuana echo those narratives. And unfortunately, we also saw, for example, people that were rejecting the migrant families, even our previous mayor in Tijuana, he was wearing a hat that said, "Make Tijuana Great Again." I was like, oh my God, how embarrassing. But I don't think that reflects the spirit of our border community. I do think racism is real, and as Tijuana becomes more multicultural, it's something that we need to address. But I also know that there's a lot of solidarity. There's starting with the churches that opened up as shelters and received all this population, and just every day, like the calls we get from students, from volunteers that want to know how to support. But for example, I'm also a student, so part of my dissertation is actually about racism in Tijuana, so that it's something that I really want to learn about more and to see how we can fight against that, because it's also a reality of Tijuana.
And then this might be, how are families awaiting a hearing? How do they get notified of their court date? How does that happen? What is that process?
So that's a problem, because I got to go to a hearing with I've been to a couple of hearings with the families at the shelter. And to begin with, the judge asked them if they have an address in Tijuana. Many of them might be staying in a shelter, but the shelter might give them a period of time, so they don't have a stable address. And also the mail in Mexico is completely not reliable. So the judge was saying, oh, you need to have an address to receive information about your court hearings. And they said, we haven't received anything, or we tried to send a letter, but it's been over 2 months. And the judge just didn't believe that. He said, how can I believe that if Tijuana is 13 miles away and I received a letter from Europe in 3 days? And I was like, wow, like they're so far from the reality in Tijuana. So yes, like information is a big problem. organizations like Al Otro Lado, who you will meet in a couple of weeks, they do this job of trying to share information through the shelters, through WhatsApp groups, through Facebook, but there's a lot of misinformation in general. And that's why many people don't make it to their hearings. Most of the time, when they have a hearing, they get a letter which says when is their next hearing. But if there's any change, or like recently that the border has been closed due to the pandemic, they have no way of knowing when it's going to reopen. In general, I think the strategy from both governments is to not give them information.
If I could add something to that too, Paulina, if you miss any one of your hearings for any reason, your case is canceled. And sometimes especially after the pandemic started, the court system, the hearing schedules got thrown way off, and so they would send out notification, but families had no way to receive it. And so if they appeared at the date that they were supposed to initially at the border, they show their papers to the Mexican authorities. If their name's not on the list exactly as it's spelled from the US to the Mexican authorities, they're not permitted to go through. And hundreds and hundreds of people, if not thousands, have been denied asylum and told that they cannot apply again for another 10 years, simply because their name didn't appear when it was supposed to in the hands of the Mexican authorities. And so, out of 50,000 people who were initially in the MPP program, dating back a year and more than like a year and a half almost, only a couple dozen people have actually been granted asylum through this program. It says it's called migrant protection protocols, but there's nothing in there about protecting migrants. It's really about, I think, the attitudes in the United States about protecting us from those that we see as a threat. And so it's a sad reality. And that's what every family, Paulina, that you host is facing, that reality that only a tiny, tiny percentage of people will ever be allowed in.
Yes, that's true. And also, we have even heard from families that show up at the time and date they're supposed to, and they don't get processed. We had a family, for example, they showed up at 4 a.m. Nobody gave them information. CBP switched shifts, and then they told them, no, you weren't here on time. And she said, yes, I was, and there was no way to convince them. We have also heard stories recently of pregnant women, particularly, that are being turned away. And it was a group of pregnant women, and we don't know if this was intentional because they are pregnant in order to avoid their children being born in the US. So many things like that we hear every day.
Thank you, Paulina. Just want to mention that it's 8 o'clock right now, and we're going to continue with some question and answer, and people should feel free to stay as long as they wish. But also, we understand if you've reserved an hour for this time and you need to leave, we understand that, and we hope that you have found the sharing of these stories educational as well as inspiring. In the midst of, I have found that the hope being expressed by our speakers this evening in the midst of what they face has been very inspiring. Question was asked about Benson. For Benson, is Benson, as far as while he's waiting for his hearing, what is he allowed to do as far as movement about? Is he allowed to move about freely, or how does that work? What's that process like? Ray, did you hear that question?
Sorry, Benson and I are both muted. He's across the table from me, so that's
Okay.
why. So, yeah, go for it again,
Yes.
Benson, sorry.
Yeah, so initially when I left detention, they put an on-call monitor on me, but they removed it after a month. So I'm still under supervision. So I'm allowed to travel freely on a radius of 120 miles from Ray's house. If I needed to go beyond that, I need to inform my case specialist 24 hours in advance. So if I'm only leaving for 48 hours, then I can only drop them a message and inform them where I'm going. But if it's more than 48 hours, then I need to inform them by call, and they have to give direct approval. I hope that answered your question.
I think it answered it. I'll ask a follow-up question. You're staying with Ray in order to be released from detention? What did you have to have in order to be released from detention? Were there certain things you had to have in place to be released?
So essentially, you must have either an American citizen or a legal permanent resident. You must have them write a letter of support for you to ICE. They must include one confirmation of the identity, either a passport, an ID, a driver's license, and also tax returns to show that they're able to support you in terms of feeding you. In case you need to go to court, you'll have a means of transport there. And they also need to show stability in terms of, this is not somewhere where you're going to maybe stay for like 2 weeks. And if your case takes a year, you're out in the streets. So essentially, those are the things you need to prove. You have a sponsor who is willing to receive you, and that they are able to receive you and capable of at least hosting you for the period pending your case being decided. And yeah, so basically that's the procedure. A few months ago, once one was released and you had stayed in detention for more than 150 days, or you had stayed for 150 days after you requested for asylum, then you are allowed to have a work permit. Unfortunately, now you have to wait for 365 days from the day you file your asylum for you to even qualify to apply for the work permit. Now, again, earlier on, there was a caveat in which the agency had to grant you a work permit within 30 days of your filing. Now, that law has been changed and that caveat has been removed. So it means it could take months, years, depending on which officer receives your documents.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing about that process. I know that's new information for me. I'm unaware of how that process works, so appreciate that. Another question, I'll stay with Benson here. Is there anything we can do to advocate for Benson's case of asylum? Are there ways that we can support him as he waits, or other individuals in his situation? And I'll leave that to Benson or to Ray.
I guess I would answer one part of that question, and maybe Ray is going to assist me answer the other part. So essentially what we've been doing with him in terms of assisting others is trying to file certain briefs for them, because not every migrant has a legal background. So if they don't have an attorney, then they're in really bad shape, especially if they are down in the South. So we've been trying to assist people as much as we can, mostly through Ray, because I can only share, my knowledge, but the rest, sometimes filing fees and sometimes, postage and everything. So, we're using quite an amount of finances been provided by Ray to do that. And in terms of advocating specifically for my case, I talked to a few lawyers and they said, unfortunately, when your case is on appeal, it's basically at the mercy of the judges, squarely. So we might have to wait until we see how that goes. And after that, maybe other measures can be taken. In terms of assisting others, there's an ongoing, I've been working a lot with Cameroonians because I understand what's going on in their country. I'm short of calling it ethnocide or genocide, like it happened in Rwanda. It's so sad that it's not been recognized for what it is. So we are working with a team of other advocates from different NGOs, and we are sharing on how we can ensure at least they are not deported, because the Trump administration has tried to deport as many as possible before he leaves office. So we're just trying to plead for them not to be deported. Some of them are okay with staying in detention as long as they don't go back home. Sometimes I get sent some really disturbing pictures by people whose brothers have been killed and cut into pieces. And sometimes it's disturbing even to myself. So in terms of lobbying, that's one way to go. And in future, I wish we would have the issues of immigration handled by, I would call it neutral arbiters. Right now, we have an immigration system that is handled through the Attorney General's office. These are judges who are appointed by an administration and specifically given instructions to serve a specific purpose. So you don't allocate 1,000 cases to a judge and give them a ceiling that you can only grant 10. So how about the other 990? It means you're telling them, deny them, even if they deserve, even if they're on merit, as long as you have the number 10 case. So in future, I would love, and I wish it were possible for Congress to come up with proper legislation on that. I hope to go back to school eventually, maybe become an admitted attorney in the US. And we've been discussing that with Trey and how he could be of assistance. So I believe he would require a lot of assistance as well in the process.
Yeah, I think Benson, it would be, I mean, you'll make a phenomenal lawyer. So Stacey, you asked about supporting Benson. I wish we knew how to advocate better for, I wish we knew what more we could do for Benson in his case. But and it's hard. He has a very good lawyer, and that the Southern Poverty Law Center was able to arrange. And he has an incredible case, even though the judge found against him. But Benson is working with several dozen Cameroonians and other Africans. He has set up a law office in our basement. And I am pleased to work as his assistant in this law enterprise, this law practice that he set up. He is teaching me a great deal, even though I studied to become an accredited rep, which is a Justice Department program to actually help have additional people be able to function for attorneys for people going through this process. Benson knows far more even than many of the lawyers that he's consulting with. And so it's fascinating to watch. He has helped a number of people be released from detention, and he has actually helped people be released. So and gain asylum. Yeah, and gain asylum. And so he's actually got a good track record going forward. It's a huge issue right now, trying to ensure that these Cameroonians are not going to be deported because they're going back to very, very dire situation. What's happening in Cameroon is not on the radar for most of us in the U.S., but it is a very, very serious, very, very serious issue. And I'm glad that people like Benson are working on it, and many, many more. So that's where we could do a lot more advocacy, I think.
Great. A couple other questions. I think we'll do one more question, then we'll wrap up for those who are still with us. But to Paulina, how are the different languages taught in school for the children and for those who get enrolled in the local schools in Tijuana? What do they do to overcome the language barrier, since there's many different languages being spoken?
Thank you. So I don't think our education system is doing much for this part. We're lucky we have a program in Tijuana that assures or supports migrant families to find a school, because I've been talking to shelters from other cities and they don't even have that. So more children get turned away. But then once they get into school, I know that this program has follow-up with the children every week, and they're trying to, for example, there's a high school where there's a group of Haitian students that are going there. So the teachers are making an effort to teach them Spanish, but there's really not a solid program like in the US. Also, I think for Mexico, it's new to be like a destination country and to have children from different parts. This program in Tijuana started for children of deported parents, for children of some of them US citizens or some of them Mexican children whose parents were deported. And they support with finding a school, but from then there's really not much support. In our organization, we're teaching Spanish, and we're also teaching English to asylum seekers that are waiting to go to the US, but I think we still have a lot of work to do regarding language access and justice.
Very good. I want to thank Paulina and Benson for sharing their stories and their work. Ray and Pastor Sarah, I'm not sure how we're wrapping up here, if that's my responsibility.
Go for it.
All right. So next week, this week we've wanted to talk about kind of the joy of release and the hope that Benson experienced, and having someone welcome him and Ray and his family to support him in that, as well as Paulina sharing about the journey of folks that she is working with down in Tijuana. Next Wednesday, not next Sunday, but next Wednesday evening, we'll have a couple other representatives. Ray, can you mention who they will be real quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. So next week, we're going to hear from Nicole Ramos, who is the director of the Mexican office of Al Otro Lado, which is a legal aid program. And it's one of the difficulties that Paulina mentioned a bit ago is, how does somebody find a lawyer in Mexico for US, if they're seeking US asylum and they're in the MPP program? Well, this is one of the very, very few programs I know that is trying to meet that need and trying to make sure that everybody has good representation. And so she's going to be speaking about her experience with the changing laws and how it is that we as a nation are doing some things hopefully well, but what the other things that we should be challenged on to do better in order to make sure we are giving welcome. And the other person is John Fanistel, who is the director of Via Internacional, which is a cross-cultural, cross-border educational program. So John's going to be talking a little bit about the history of the border itself, and also the historical relationships between between people on both sides, to learn a little bit more about U.S. involvement and the areas in which we need to be challenged to do better. And this is obviously an opportunity for advocacy for many of us. And so we'll have those two, and then a time for question for them as well. And then the last night, make sure you come back for the 16th, because we're going to have a representative from Church World Service with us. Stacy is on the call, on the Zoom call tonight. Stacy Clack, but also we're going to have Peter Pedamonte from New Sanctuary Movement of Philadelphia. And they're going to be talking about what it is that we as individuals and as churches can do to respond. How it is perhaps we can sponsor, we can be part of refugee resettlement efforts, and how we can also do advocacy on behalf of those we recognize as our brothers and sisters, those in whom we see Christ on the other side, knocking at the door, how it is that we then respond.
Great, thank you. So going to close with a poem by Anne Weems in a book called Kneeling in Bethlehem. And this will kind of serve as our closing meditation for our time together this evening. It's the coming of God. Our God is the one who comes to us in a burning bush, in an angel song, in a newborn child. Our God is the one who cannot be found, locked in the church, not even in the sanctuary. Our God will be where God will be, with no constraints and no predictability. Our God lives where our God lives, and destruction has no power, and even death cannot stop the living. Our God will be born where God will be born, but there is no place to look for the one who comes to us. When God is ready, God will come, even to a God-forsaken place like a stable in Bethlehem. Watch, for you know not when God comes. Watch, that you might be found whenever, wherever God comes. Let's just close our time with a brief prayer. Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to join across these congregations within our American Baptist Church family and others as well. Thank you for Paulina and Benson sharing their stories this evening with us. May we be mindful as we leave this place, as we leave this time of being together, to consider your Spirit and what your Spirit is speaking to us. And when you come to us, maybe we be ready to provide a place of welcome, and may we listen to what your Spirit says. In Christ's name, amen.
Thank you everyone for coming tonight, and we hope to see you next week. You should be able to use the same link and tell your friends to come as well. The more the merrier here. We want to share this story far and wide. So thank you all. Have a great night, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, and as you go, unmute your mics for a second, and shout out a word of hope for all of us to hear. Bless you all. Thank you, and we'll see you.
Felicidades.
Thank you, God.
Thank you.
Hallelujah. Emmanuel, God is with us. Be encouraged, Benson.
Live on.
Thank
Thank you.
Mucho amor. Bye.
Amor, 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 amor.
you. Thanks, Paulina. Bless you, Paulina.
Esperanza, esperanza. Dios les bendiga.
Bye.
Thank you, Ray. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Blessings, blessings.